Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a NCR webinar for our members. Many of you I know have recently given to our fund drive, and we want to thank you so much so that we can keep doing fun events and keep us employed. And we're really lucky and blessed today to have two really North America's finest, theological legends with us. Catherine Clifford is a professor of systematic and historical theology at St. Paul's in Ottawa. Massimo Faggioli is a theologian at Villanova University. Both are well known to NCR readers, have published with NCR over the years. But we're here to discuss specifically this book, the Oxford Handbook on Vatican II, of Vatican II, I should say, which, as you can see, my copy is dog-eared and underlined every page, and I just ran a two-part review of it and really just scratched the surface because it's a magnificent book. And it's one of those ones, there are certain books you read and you put it on the shelf, and then there's others you just say, this stays on the desk. Like, this is something I'm going to be referring to. And this is one of the latter. And so we're going to start a conversation with these two editors of this volume. And then also be opening it to questions. I will be on and off with my glasses so I can read what the questions are and look for your questions in the chat room. Just post them there if you have them, and we'll get going. So I'm going to start with you, Catherine. You have this chapter on ecumenism, which was very well done. And you described the very sad state of Catholic participation in the ecumenical movement before the council. I remember the first apostolic delegate to the United States, Satoli, in the 1890s. This was the thing that horrified him, was that Catholics had participated in certain ecumenical affairs. And so really, throughout the first half of the 20th century here in the US, they were just absent. The Catholics were just absent from that movement. And then in your essay, and indeed in the whole section of the book that deals with how other churches received Vatican II, it paints a very different picture and one of almost unforeseeable progress. So my question is, what are the 2 or 3 key things that happened at and around Vatican II that really took us from nowhere to things people could not have foreseen in 1960?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Michael, and thanks also for your really careful reading. You've done something that few people will do, that actually read it from cover to cover, because this is really a reference book, and a lot of students will consult individual chapters. And but I think it's important to say the council couldn't have happened if there wasn't a long preparation by scholars, but also by pastors working at the ground level, to think differently about a whole host of questions, and some of them touching the ecumenical question. So before Vatican II, in the 1917 Code of Canon Law, it was illegal for Catholics to gather together with Christians from other churches, except in extraordinary circumstances. So the mayor could get permission from somebody to go to attend a funeral or something like that, but not pray together, and not, they wouldn't even dream of receiving sacraments together or anything like that. But in spite of that, there's a whole lot of work that's bubbling up underneath the surface. And so beginning back in the 1930s, we see scholars like Father Yves Congar, his first major book is inviting us to think differently about the way we regard other Christians and their communities. And so, and in the middle of the 1900s, in 1948, we see the founding of the World Council of Churches. There's a lot of contact going on. And beginning from 1949, Catholics may now meet together. And of course, this is all going on very discreetly. But there's also groups of theologians, Catholic theologians, meeting to study and discuss the questions that are being debated within the wider ecumenical movement. And they actually provide the competencies that they become expert advisors during the council itself. So I think that kind of sets the stage for what we see in the Decree on Ecumenism, which creates the conditions now to enter into dialogue with other churches, to recognize them more generously as churches and Christian communities, but also recognizes the Catholic Church's own responsibility for the divisions and in the past, and the acknowledgement that the Catholic Church needs to renew and reform itself if it's to be reconciled with other communities.
To follow up, and a quick, technical thing, which is you said to think differently, and could you just explain to the audience, like, think differently from what? It was just this Roman neo-scholastic?
Yeah. Well, we called the Orthodox and Protestant Christians, we called them heretics and schismatics. So the Orthodox had always been invited to other councils, and they were always considered churches. There was a kind of ecclesiological exclusivism still that filtered in the centuries of isolation. And some people weren't even prepared to call the Orthodox communities churches, or to recognize their ministries and sacraments as the council does. So Congar's question, though, has to do with the Protestant churches, which came out of the 16th century, for the fragmentation of the church in the West. And he says, we can't call these people 400 years after the Protestant Reformation, we can't call these people heretics as if they're actively opposing the church and causing division in the way that the heretics of the 2nd and 3rd century did. There's something ecclesial there. There's so much of in common with us that comes from our common patrimony, and we have to find more generous theological language to acknowledge this. And this begins also by acknowledging our common baptism, to say, the council says we have a sacramental bond, and that's really everything else hinges on the mutual recognition of baptism.
You have, so in addition, and so the audience knows this, there's 2 sections of the book that deal with the reception of the council. One is by region, North America, Asia, Europe, and that was very interesting. But the other was, by the Methodists, by the Jewish community, by the Muslim community. And I had myself never thought of a non-Catholic church receiving Vatican II, and yet as I'm reading it, that was exactly what was going on. It was this dialogue and this change. Talk a little bit about why you thought those were important parts of this volume.
Well, I think that section on how other Christian churches have received the council is important. It's important to acknowledge all of Christianity is changed by this event. Not just the relationship with Catholicism, but internally, so that when the Catholic Church renews its liturgical life, so does every other Western Christian church. And they take the model of the revised Roman Rite. We have a common lectionary in the English-speaking and French-speaking world with mainline Protestant churches, with Lutherans and Anglicans and many Reformed Christians. The fact that other Christians have really been recovering the Sunday celebration of the Eucharist, honoring the seasons of Lent and Advent. This is all linked to the liturgical renewal that's at the heart of Vatican II. So that's important, I think, to acknowledge. The other thing we wanted to highlight in that last section that has contributions from every continent is to say the council has not been received uniformly everywhere. And that's quite appropriate, that in different contexts and different cultural worlds, that there is a kind of differentiated reception of the council's teaching.
So, and Massimo, so that leads me to ask you to extrapolate a bit on something you wrote that I thought was really important. That in discussing the post-war migration of Catholic populations to more religiously diverse countries, where ecumenism was going to be a fact of daily life, whether in a way it hadn't been if you were either in the ethnic urban Catholic neighborhood of the late 19th, early 20th century, or coming from Italy to England or to Australia or to Canada, these more religiously and to the US, more religiously diverse countries. So in describing that, you wrote, and I think this was really, really important. Let me put it. Religion ceased to be associated primarily with specific denominations and denominational creeds, and came to be associated with broad ethical and political trends along liberal and conservative political lines, close quote. And I guess my question is this the downside of ecumenism, and how do we keep it from being a downside of ecumenism?
So thank you very much for this question. Thank you for your review, as Catherine said. And I just want to start by saying that this is a collective work that Catherine and I have coordinated, 45 chapters from all continents. So I'm very grateful to NCR and to you for acknowledging this work that has been in the work for a few years now. So your questions is very relevant, especially because it at the same time accepts and challenges a certain North American reading of the Second Vatican Council and of Catholicism, which means Vatican II is good or bad according to what you make of the social political arrangements of Catholics today, of the social political order. And so it's an undeniable fact that the Second Vatican Council takes place in a hinge decade when there is a transition from a certain understanding of mission to a secular world, to it's the last decade where there is a recognizable presence of Catholic parties and Catholic politicians in the Western world. So I think it would be disingenuous to disassociate Vatican II at that event and its reception from the beginning of a certain split within Western Catholicism, exactly, that follows more social, cultural, and ideological fault lines more than confessional ones. Okay, but this is, I believe, also the value of this project, that we want to be honest and look in the eyes at the unexpected consequences of the Second Vatican Council in Europe, in North America, but at the same time, not to reduce Vatican II to what happened after 68, after Humane Vitae, after Roe v. Wade, okay? Because this is a much bigger history in the global world, but also within our, I mean, my European context where I come from, and in North America. So our effort has been to offer a reference work that takes seriously some of the objections that have become really part of the menu of a certain neoconservative or traditionalist rendition of the Second Vatican Council as a concession to liberal modernity, a sellout, all of that. This is something that our project has been very intentional in responding to that kind of dismissal, which is often sheer ignorance of what Vatican II said, how it unfolded. And so here the ecumenical section, the global section are integral, and this is the newest, I believe, part of the discussion, which has been in these last few years very much conditioned by national political debates. And these are very important, but they must be put into a larger framework. Otherwise, we lose the old concept of what Vatican II had in mind, the one human family, the one family of Christians, the one Catholic community around the world.
So, and I guess this leads to a question I'll pose to both of you, which is, I was a little surprised and also kind of happy, depending on how you answer this question, that in the book there was not as much as I expected about the different perspectives that emerge after the council between the concilium theologians and the communio theologians. And as you talk about these liberal, conservative, political, and social biases and conditions that shape how people interpret what it means to be Catholic in the post-conciliar era, I guess my question is, how do those track and not track with the concilium communio differences? And is it just the case that we're realizing that those differences were overstated at the time? I remember an essay recently, I think it was First Things by George Weigel, and he said, well, the communio school, it won over. And a bishop, asked if I had seen it, and I said, I had, and I didn't think it was very smart. But he said something I thought was really important. He said, I think Pope Francis has just completely relativized and moved beyond those divisions.
Yep.
And I thought, wow, that's a really remarkable claim. And then I started looking at Francis's text a little bit differently and realizing I think the bishop was on to something, that there are elements of both in this pontificate really clearly. And anyway, so let me just throw that kind of large question to both of you.
Well, I think that's a very astute observation, that Francis comes from the global South. And in the last half century also, the Catholic Church has moved to the global South. And the principal concerns of Catholics are not the concerns of a bunch of old men, about a bunch of old European men arguing about the number of angels on the head of a pin, it's theologically in a sense. So in that sense, I think we could say, yes, we've moved to a different point in moving beyond these ideas of how to interpret and understand the council, or who won and who lost. I just think that those arguments, yes, they're important for us as scholars to debate, but Francis is drawing our attention to the real, practical, lived realities of the church, and asking us, I think, as a theological community, also to say, where can we find the tools to respond to these questions now, because they're urgent.
And Massimo, obviously, let's specify this and talk about the hermeneutical question, which,
right.
How does this book answer the debate that has been going on for a long time? But in 2005, when Pope Benedict gave his address to the Curia and said, this hermeneutic is bad and this is the one that did it, and then I would argue the misrepresentations of what Ratzinger said. I was on the floor of the bishops' conference when Cardinal DiNardo chastised then Bishop, now Cardinal McElroy, and said, well, Benedict called for a hermeneutic of continuity, and that was not. Benedict said a hermeneutic of reform with elements of both continuity and discontinuity. So setting aside, the people who are going to misrepresent anything for the moment, how did your book try to address this issue of the hermeneutic that lays behind, I think, what Catherine was just talking about also?
Yes, so this is important because this project starts a few years after the beginning of the pontificate of Pope Francis. Mm-hmm. It was after the first wave of the bishop synods of Francis on family, marriage, Amoris Laetitia, all of that. And we realized that what was happening was, first, a very important moment in the life of the church, in the sense of a re-reception, a reassessment, and a rediscovery of the Second Vatican Council by Pope Francis in a very intentional way, not nominalistic or casual, but with a project of rebalancing some of the extreme narratives that were around in the church. Second, this is a project that is located in its conception, but also in its reception in the English-speaking context. which has become a very problematic place for the reception of the Second Vatican Council in terms of the resurgence of a traditionalist narratives, which is no longer confined to the old neoconservative thesis, which was basically Vatican II good, some aspects of the receptions bad, okay, but the neo-traditionalist wave says basically Vatican II bad, period. This has become a real problem in our conversations in the church at the intellectual level, but also at the pastoral level. And so this has become a fixture in our daily conversations in the Catholic Church, also because if you remember, I mean, to connect to your first question on concilium and communio, I remember when Pope Francis mentioned Cardinal Casper as one of his favorite theologians. We remember in some American US newspapers when Cardinal Casper being attacked by a prominent conservative columnist in the New York Times as a heretic, basically ignoring completely, I mean, sheer ignorance that Casper has been part of the communio school, actually, not of the liberal progressives. And so here there is a whole narrative that has to be restored to a little bit more of, I mean, fact-based conversation, because we have our, I mean, Catherine and I, we have our, I mean, options, our preferences, but we thought that it was necessary, and I believe that this volume has become even more relevant compared to when we started thinking about that. If we keep in mind what has happened in these last few years on the liturgical reform in the English-speaking context, for example, Traditionis Custodes and Desiderio Desideravi, this is really about Vatican II, theologically, fundamentally, not about just questions of personal taste, but at the bottom there is what is the role, what is the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. And so this has been our intention all along. And the more we see this pontificate doing things, synodality on Islam and so on, we see how much Vatican II is coming more and more at the center of what is in the intention of this pontificate.
Can I just add also, Michael, I think even, Massimo and I were approached by Oxford to take on this project, and we had to sit down and identify who would write such a thing. And we had to develop, we looked for the best scholars who are people who are not going to be sucked into these polarizing debates and give the readers a very balanced presentation. I mean, that's also the reason why we have a whole section up front to say, let's put the council in its context and then understand that, yes, there are continuities and new developments at Vatican II, and that there, that this tension or this dynamic between, ressourcement, being rooted in the sources of tradition and still renewing the church, updating and being involved in a legitimate and important development in areas of doctrine. That's the kind of presentation of the council we've sought to give, and I hope we've succeeded. I think we're happy with what the authors have produced.
Absolutely. And I think, I thought one of the real achievements of the book was to remind people that it's not just a collection of documents. Vatican II was an event. And so I forget which essay it was that mentioned, you have that sense of the diversity of the church was not just discussed, but as these ancient rites, totally legitimate, the Syro-Malabar rite, the Antiochene, these were celebrating the different masses every day. It was not just the Roman Rite that was beginning each day's service, these different, so this idea, well, there's only one way, was being disproven before their eyes before they even started talking. And that great highlight when Montini led the Milanese Rite, right? The Ambrosian Rite. This was, people were scratching their heads. What do you mean the words are different? Well, this is our church, and that had just been lost for so long. We've just so the audience knows, we exchanged some questions beforehand, but I'm going to jump to one that came into the chat from my good friend Jim Purcell, who's out in Santa Clara. And he said, what lessons might we take from how slowly the reception of Vatican II has taken place in thinking about and planning how to facilitate the reception of the Synod on synodality? Why should we assume it has to take 50 to 100 years to, quote, receive a council? And will it be the same for the Synod? Either or both of you, take a whack at that.
So historically, councils that are epoch-making, like Trent, for example, take many decades. One example, one of the most genial inventions of the Tridentine Church was the seminary for the formation of the priests. And in the average diocese in the Catholic Church, it takes 1 century after the end of Trent to have a seminary. And so this is even more with Vatican II, because Vatican II is the first global council where you have theologians and bishops coming from 5 continents. It's not just Europe with some additions or some presences from North America, South America, as it was Vatican I. And so that's why this process, it takes time. And so synodality is, I believe, the most important institutional moment for the reception of the Second Vatican Council since 1965, because it tries very hard to make the synthesis about what it means to be a church in terms of governance, in terms of ways of being together, that tries to keep together, one, the institutional element or the hierarchical element, second, the collegial element, and third, the synodal element. This is a massive, massive enterprise and epoch-making moment. So it takes time, but it moves. It has not been still and inactive until now. It's the contrary, actually.
One of the questions I like to ask my students, Michael, is how do you propose to move 1.3 billion people if you want to introduce a change? So while we've been attempting to receive the council, the world population has doubled. The population of the Catholic Church has doubled. The number of dioceses and bishops has doubled. And the preponderance of the Catholic population has moved to the global south. And it's the largest, fastest growing community today is in Africa, not in Europe and North America. So all of this is kind of, it's a kind of disruption. There's not a calm equilibrium into which we're receiving the insights of the council or trying to put it into practice. And so it's a very, very complex process. And we can also ask, have we done enough to form priests, pastors, bishops, lay people to understand the council's teaching and to let it inform the way of our living? And I think the Pope Francis' insight into the constitutive dimension of synodality is really profound, and it will change the face of Christianity in the future. It also has a profound ecumenical dimension. We would not be experimenting and learning how to become a more synodal church if we were not in dialogue with other Christian churches about the exercise of authority in the church. Right. And this has forced us to examine the imbalance in our own life and practice. And other churches are also looking at questions and shortcomings in their own structuring and governing practices. But this is a really pivotal moment, I think, in church history and in the reception of the council.
Also, and I'll ask you guys if you can point me to it. I've always been looking for in English or French or Spanish, something I could read. On this, the 1974 Synod of Bishops, where the working document was rejected by the Synod Fathers. And so for the first time, you have a synod that doesn't issue a document. They just left it all on Paul VI's desk. And that produced this amazing document the next year, Evangelii Nuntiandi, but also this new MO, which is the synod does the discussion, may have a working document that it approves, doesn't approve, whatever, leaves for the Pope. Who was the author of that working document that was rejected in 1974?
I am sure that one of those worked at that was the then secretary, which meant the leader president of the Italian Bishop Conference, Enrico Bartoletti, was a man very close to Paul the VI, and took a lot of flack on behalf of Paul VI in his entire career as a bishop. And so you're right, that is a big change in what it means to be a synod. I think we have come back now to the synods that we saw in the 1970s, more than those of the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s. And so this is something that has been blamed to be an innovation, democratism, all of that. But actually, this is one of the immediate consequences of the Second Vatican Council. I mean, that things between 63 and 64, how can we make this church less monarchical? And so the first step back then is a synod, which is step 2 is collegiality. Pope Francis now is making step 3, monarchical, I mean, papacy, episcopacy, and then collegiality. And then step 3 now is synodality. And so this is very consistent with the trajectories that Vatican II initiated. And so this is a history that, I mean, makes a lot of sense if you follow the first steps of this Catholic conversation. What is a council? What is papacy? What is being bishop today?
I just want to say, I'm pretty sure the person who did that working draft was the Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła. Or was the Relator General or something, that he had a key role in the 74 Synod and came away feeling my work was rejected by them. And I attended a couple synods as a reporter during his pontificate, and he would famously be up there reading a different book. I mean, they had the small group discussions, and it wasn't that nothing was accomplished. It was also the case, it was not a synod in any meaningful way. And then Ratzinger comes along, and as Pope Benedict, he introduces what I call the karaoke hour at the end, which is for an hour, you could go to the microphone and talk about anything you wanted, right? And that was an important step in saying, the way John Paul did things isn't the way we always have to do them. So, but let's find out, John, but here, anyone who's listening, church historians, take note. What was Karol Wojtyła's role in the 74 Synod? And I think that gets into his prejudice against synods, that he was a man who, once he made up his mind about something, was not usually open to much change. I mean, I'm half Polish. I know about stubbornness. So he had that quality, and I think it was rooted there. But it's one of those things I would like to find a good article on. Anyway, let's keep moving. As we were talking about the global reception, and I think to get back to Jim's question about why does it take 100 years, part of it is this dialectic of it goes to the local churches and it's going to be received differently. But then, sometimes things do go off track. Sometimes, and so it comes back. And in the section of the book on global reception, in the chapter on Asia, the author, whose name I would do a bad job with, so I'm not going to.
Shaji
George. He wrote this. It seems that even now, clericalism and the hierarchical model of the church exert considerable influence, close quote. And I thought it strange to equate clericalism, which is kind of, by definition, a distortion or a malady of some sort, with a hierarchical model of the church, which was certainly relativized at Vatican II, but it wasn't tossed overboard. And why I think that's important. And so I want to ask you, am I missing something? But it's for this reason. I have an enormous fear that the Vatican, the U.S. bishops, certainly, I don't know how it's being done in other countries. They're not doing a great job managing expectations for the synodal process. And you can read the pages of NCR, you can read the pages of the conservative, press, and there are very clear. Oh my God, we're going to have this, this, and this, and it's like, the church, as you pointed out, Catherine, it moves slowly because you're involved. How do you get over 1 billion people to shift direction? So I guess that's my question, is specifically that clericalism versus the hierarchy. I don't think the synodal process is going to result in a rejection of hierarchicalism. It may look differently, but is that what was it? Anyway, that was one of the things I underlined.
I think you have to understand Shaji's context. So Father Shaji George is a professor of theology in Bangalore, India, teaching in ethics and moral theology. But I think it's a very honest assessment of the culture of the church in Asia. And it's a culture that's pervasive. It's present in all of our contexts. But in Asian cultures, there are caste systems. There's ancestor of veneration and veneration of parents and a kind of deferential culture. So it's really, really hard. This adds to the culture of clericalism in a very particular way. And I think it's true that if we introduce new structures and new processes, that doesn't change the culture. And culture eats structure every time. So to change the culture, we have to change our whole process of Christian formation and formation for ministry, and give people the skills to work together as a community, but as adult Christians together in a common journey. And that's a generational change. It can't happen overnight.
Go ahead.
So what's happening now is also that the synodal process has made emerge some important differences in terms of how we understand the ministry and clergy and the structure of the church within one same continental context. For example, if you look at how churches in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe have looked at this, or for example, between the United States and Australia, there are very different cultures, expectations of what it means to be member of the same church, a certain culture of egalitarianism, of democracy, of participation. So one of the things that could happen is that at the synod, after the synod, we will see slight differences in the ways in which national continental churches will update their structures, because it is not certain, not clear to me, for example, what is the future role of the national bishop conferences in a synodal church. They will continue to exist, but if you look at what's happening in Germany, for example, you see that there's a whole conversation on, is the future in the hands of the bishop conference or of a national synodal council, right? And so this is something that is happening in these months and will happen, but I think that at Vatican II, we still had one model, one Roman model that was supposed to be universal. And now we are a global Catholic Church, which is different from universal. So it's more complicated. But this is something that can be understood if one looks at how Vatican II started to imagine enculturation, different forms of Christian life. It comes from there, I think.
So that's leads naturally. I want to, Catherine, you did a piece for NCR this week about the inclusion of lay people in the upcoming synod, and you noted that first of all, it's a consultative body, not a deliberative, and they will be a quarter of the body. But you said they're still going to have significant influence, and what that immediately brought back, from the book, was the role of the non-Catholic observers, who didn't even have a vote and yet profoundly affected the debate. And do you think that in ways that may be hard for us to even understand, that there's that kind of thing is going to happen at the synod, that the inclusion of a quarter of the body is going to be non-bishops?
Yeah.
Who knows what effect that's going to have? Or are there some things that we can say, oh, here's where it's going to have an effect?
I have no doubt. Imagine a group of men sitting around having a beer together, and a woman walks into the room. Everything changes. The whole dynamic changes. So when ecumenical observers were present at the council, when women showed up at the council, the bishops had to adjust their discourse. They knew that everything they wanted to say would be heard. And so even if those other people don't have a voice in the synod, they will have a voice and they will have a vote. So they really, there were 23 women at Vatican II as official observers in the last two sessions of the council. They had profound influence on the church's teaching on the ends of marriage, on the way it presents women and the rights of women. And I would say also, in all of that experience, the most liberating experience for women at the council, and the most liberating teaching of the council, is the recognition of our baptism. So I think what's at play here is we're really beginning now to take seriously the dignity of the baptized faithful, and this is essential for the way forward. And it's a key teaching of the council, understanding the church as the baptized people of God. We've been slow to receive this. This is not about democracy. This is about the dignity of those who've been redeemed by Christ, redeemed sinners who've received the Holy Spirit in baptism. And that Spirit doesn't leave us. That Spirit doesn't leave us. And that's the Spirit that's guiding the church. And that's why we have, that Francis is saying, we cannot go forward without attending to the voice of the Spirit that's born in the baptized people of God.
Amen. Amen. I just want to say, I have to tell you, there are times when I read George Weigel when I think the Spirit has left. But go ahead, Massimo.
Just to go back to, to prose after this poetry of a baptism, I'm really curious to see if at the synod in October in Rome, it will be visible the different ways in which bishops and non-bishops members vote, because that will say something. If on some key votes, all non-bishops vote as a block in a certain way, that will send a certain kind of message. So I don't know if there is already an order that votes are secret, if it will be changed now, but certainly it will change also the understanding of, majorities, minorities, because it's not just about who wins the vote, is how you come to that vote, what is the reception of that vote of the majority, and 1/4 of non-bishop members, half of them being women, is really something new that we never had before.
I think, it's the dynamic is, as you say, Kat, it's going to entirely change. It just, there's I've spent a lot of time covering bishops' conferences here in the US, and yeah, when you walk into a conversation where there's a half dozen bishops talking, and you walk in, it's not just because you're a journalist, it's because you don't have the chain across, that the conversation is going to change. But it also, that change works both ways. And Massimo has been the last couple of years, we've helped to organize this meeting of theologians and bishops and other church leaders. And one of the things that really happens is that oftentimes theologians have not had the experience of spending a couple days, at cocktail hour and lunch and dinner with bishops and finding out, guess what? They're human beings and they have families and they have stresses and they're good at this and not good at that. And sometimes they know it. So it's a two-way street there. There's one question that came up that I really want to throw out. And it was, how might your handbook be of use to those in formation work, either religious deacons or priests? And if you have some ideas on that.
Well, everyone associated with any institution of higher learning, a college or university, will probably find the handbook on their university library catalog. And so they can access it even without paying the ridiculous price to buy the whole book, but they could download individual chapters. I use some of these handbook chapters as course readings in some of my courses. So that's, I think, the most important thing. It's there as a resource, and for students working at higher levels, it should still be a starting point for them when they start doing their research on questions about the council or various council documents. So hopefully, by having it available electronically, I think it makes it much more widely available. And we have to encourage people to make use of those resources. And the pandemic really forced us all to shift to electronic resources, because students are still not, spending a lot of time on campus and ferreting around on the library shelves for sources. They're going to look first in the library database and catalog. So
let's stick on the synod. So one of the interesting parts of this book, and it was the part where I just acknowledged that, I can't really assess the chapter that Father Robotor did on the reception in Africa, because I don't know enough about the African church to know whether he's accurate or not. I read them all. They rang true. There were a couple times I thought, but I guess my question is, in addition, are there specific areas of theological reflection or of geographic reception that, as you were editing these books, that you were bringing together, that you say, this is really important? And I guess the first example I'll throw out and steal, if you were thinking of using it, is that this idea of including lay people was just done by Ceylon, right? Like they, instead of having their annual meeting in Guadalupe be a synod of bishops, as Aparecida and Puebla and Medellin had been, they called it an Asamblea Eclesial, right? When it included lay people, and everybody said, oh my God, it worked really well. And it really did change some of these dynamics. So are there other things from the Latin American reception, the Asian, the African, that you think really we should be paying attention to in this synodal process that have a connection to Vatican II, the geographic reception, that you're like, ding, 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 this is a key thing for us to look at, for both of you?
I would say this, that it doesn't look directly connected to the synod, but it is the importance, especially Africa, Asia, but also Latin America, of ecumenism and religious liberty. Why? Because these are two documents that speak directly to those who at Vatican II were still dreaming of rebuilding the lost European medieval Christendom. The synodal project or process is the boldest acknowledgement that there's no way of going back to a Christian confessional state, a Christian confessional society, which is something that is hard to accept for some Catholics in the United States and in Europe today, Orban, Meloni in my own country, and so on. And so if you look at how important ecumenism, freedom of religion has been for Christians, Catholics in Asia, Africa, especially, it is impossible to reduce and belittle Vatican II to something that was a liberal project, a modernist project. And at the synod, I believe there will be the moment of reckoning, because when you are in a global assembly, it will be impossible to convince everyone that the urgent things of small groups of ideologues are really what should drive the agenda of Catholicism in this century. So this is, I believe, it has been my experience, I mean, in editing these chapters, but also in talking to these colleagues, that here Vatican II is something that is beyond the point of return for them. And so that has implications on our way of being church, of being missionaries, of being witnesses, of teaching, of doing social work, on everything.
I would say also, I hope there's some good learning there for North American readers to discover, again, the preponderance of Catholicism that's in the global South, to see that the models of the church, say, structured in basic or small Christian communities in Latin America, that experiment has and is being carried forward in Africa and in Asia. And the questions driving the church or the pastoral concerns of the church, especially in Asia and Africa, but we could say have to do with poverty, in Latin America also, but the daily reality of the majority of members of the church is one of extreme poverty and fragility, and then there's the concern of in Asia, it's a question because the Christians are in such a minority, dialogue with other peoples of other faiths, and the driving issue of enculturation. I think we're at a different time today. Vatican II doesn't even use the word enculturation. It talks about the need to adapt in the local churches, but to find an African form of Christianity, an Asian form, and it's not, again, there are multiple cultures in each of these continents. This is really important. And those questions are facing us here in North America, in Canada particularly, and it's maybe not reflected yet in our chapter on North America, but we're beginning a conversation about how to indigenize the faith among indigenous peoples in North America and Australia and elsewhere. So I think these are the questions we need to face going forward.
Yeah, I think, there's a great influence on me was Lorenzo Alvosafe, who was this, magnificent Puerto Rican Monsignor who weighed 9 million pounds and always had his breakfast here and at the ashes of about a pack of cigarettes on. And he was talking once with Cardinal O'Malley at the New York City encounter that Comunione Liberazione does. And he used this very powerful word, which the Cardinal had been talking about, had just been with Pope Francis when he went to Assisi that first time, and he met with the children who, had various disabilities, and the Holy Father had said, these are the wounds of Christ alive amongst us, and that we worship the wounds of Christ, right? These are the wounds that these are, and that idea that it's not just like us taking care of the global South. It's like the person who has something to teach us is the poor person, the disabled person, these are embodying Christ in a way we're not. And Lorenzo said, this is not a metaphor. if they are not in a very real way the wounds of Christ, there has been a disincarnation. And I go back to Gaudium et Spes 22, which is, plucked right from de Lubac, and that's the passage for the listener, only in the light of Christ does man find his fullest vocation. And this is that. And I think, one of the things that I was blessed to spend a fair amount of time in Puerto Rico and realized when a faith gets carried by the culture, it has a much less rigid, much less notional, conscient kind of understanding of what it means to be a Catholic, and you get much less judgment. You get, so when I first sat, and started listening to Pope Francis, what became clear to me, was he's a Jesuit, like discernment and the role of discernment in everything and the role that discernment is now playing in our synodal process because he's a Jesuit, right? I mean, it's having but also the Latin experience that he's from a place where the faith generates culture. It's, when we talk about enculturation, it is making something new. The U.S. Catholicism, for better or ill, is not like Italian Catholicism, or and we have to, learn from each other. I think that's the part of the synodal process I'm looking forward to is, will the American contingent, and here, frankly, depending on who goes, sometimes the lay people are the worst. Let's not kid ourselves. If you go into an archdiocesan pastoral council and you have a really tricky thing that you've got to discuss, 9 times out of 10, the clergy are going to be much more sympathetic than the lay people are the ones who are like, we don't want gay kids in our school. I mean, that is the reality of the U.S. church today. And so I think, in the post-conciliar period, when everyone was like, we need more lay involvement, when you have groups like, the Napa Institute and EWTN and what the Knights of Columbus has become, very well funded, very well organized, be very careful when you ask for lay decision-making in the U.S. church. I think that could have a different flavor. But anyway, I just want to point out, all these things are moving. We talk about them like, this is the Latin church, this is the U.S. church, and all these things are moving. And I guess that's what I hope is going to be the thing that comes from the synod is a better awareness of how the Spirit is calling us and the need to surrender to that by listening to each other. We have 1 minute left, and I guess we should. I've got to turn it back to Lori for a minute, but I just want to say on the formation thing, I do think it's an expensive book, and the thing is an option, but this is money well spent. And if you're a pastor and you're listening, if you are a dean and you're listening, get the book, get it, have it around, have it accessible. You can share it with your DRE, but also with your other catechists in a parish. It's authoritative, it's smart. There's it's been a long time since I've read a book where I didn't stop and say that's not very smart, and at some point, and it was so well done. So thank you, not just for joining us here today, but especially thank you for the book. It was just magnificent. Just keep the faith. I am so encouraged by the synodal process. It feels like it is such an important way of re-engaging Vatican II, and I know for many people, and looking at some of the comments in the chat, depending on who your bishop is and where you live, like there's been a lot of discouragement in the last 60 years also. And I just feel like we're being re-invited, and that discouragement there was in the providence of God, and maybe we needed it. Maybe there were lessons to be drawn from that too. But we're back in this. The issues are consequential. I didn't even get to the question, but like one of the stunning things, the book almost never talks about sex, and Catholics, all they talk about is sex now. I mean, it reminds us what's really important and valuable in this, in out of the council. Reread the documents, get this book. Thank you, Massimo and Catherine. And as the Holy Father says, adelante siempre, always forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.